Chapter 35, Part 1. The Performance of the Cantatas and Passions. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. J.S. Bach, Volume 2 by Albert Schweitzer, translated by Ernest Newman. Chapter 35, Part 1. The Performance of the Cantatas and Passions. A lively contest rages at present as to the way to perform Bach's vocal works. The main point in dispute is whether the cantatas and passions are to be given according to the original scores, or whether we should make more or less drastic modern arrangements of them. Perhaps this discussion attracts far too much attention to itself, so that another and elementary question receives less consideration than it deserves, the question, that is, of the phrasing. When time pressed, and Bach could only look hastily over the orchestral parts, he marked the phrasing but not the dynamic nuances. He attached more importance indeed to the phrasing than to the correctness of the parts. Many a time he has inserted ties and left wrong notes unaltered, though he must have perceived them had he read the score with ordinary care. Footnote. For example, in the cantatas Christus der ist mein Leben, number 95, and Ich bin ein guter Hirt, number 85. End footnote. In present-day performances we are not nearly careful enough as to the phrasing. The majority of conductors do not as yet sufficiently appreciate its significance to insist on the instrumentalists phrasing properly. As they find no phrasing marks in most of the cantatas, they think that Bach had no particular wishes in this respect, and that it is enough if the notes are strung together in any seemly fashion. Even when a cantata is being given in which the parts are covered with Bach's own ties, both players and conductor very often think they are following his directions when they are not realizing his wishes in the slightest. The first thing necessary to give life and rhythm to Bach's themes and periods is his own phrasing. It has a character of its own. If this is disregarded, if instead of the authentic phrasing we adopt a general one that is applicable to any kind of music, the work becomes peculiarly heavy and inert. The color of it fades, the outlines are effaced, the hearer can no longer follow the several voices. All he hears is an inextricable and wearisome medley. The work makes no vital impression. If we look merely at this or that cantata with Bach's phrasing marks, it is impossible for us to realize the importance and the bearing of them. For this we need to examine a large number of works of which he has carefully revised the parts. The chief of these are the Brandenburg concertos, the St. Matthew Passion, the B minor Mass, the Christmas Oratorio, and the Easter Oratorio. The following secular cantatas, Phoebus and Pan, Schleicht spielend Wellen, and O holder Tag, and the following church cantatas, Wer sich selbst erhöht, number 47, Herr gehe nicht ins Gericht, number 105, Liebster Gott, wann werd ich sterben, number 8, Ach Gott, wie manches Herzleid, number 58, O Ewigkeit, du Donnerwort, number 60, Ich habe genug, number 82, Ich will den Kraustype, number 56, Christus, der ist mein Leben, number 95, The World Weinem und Hüllen, number 103, Freut euch ihr Herzen, number 66, Bleib bei uns, number 6, Am Abend aber desselbigen Sabbats, number 42, Es wartet alles auf dich, number 187, Süßer Trost, mein Jesu kommt, number 151, Liebste Jesu, mein Verlangen, number 32. Mein Seufzer, meine Tränen, number 13. Christ unser Herr zum Jordan kam, first chorus, number 7. And Nimm von uns, Herr, number 101. Footnote. Of course, not all the numbers in these cantatas are phrased to the same extent. End footnote. Anyone who has carefully studied these works, or a number of them, feels that a new light has been thrown for him upon the question of the grouping and the sequences of notes. He becomes aware of a wealth of tonal combinations that were previously undreamt of by him. The most wonderful thing, however, is that this multiplicity is not the product of accident or caprice, but seems to come from certain basic ideas as to the combination of a complex of notes in a long musical period. Characteristic and individual as this phrasing seems, it is quite natural when we see the origin and nature of it. It comes from the idea of the natural use of the somewhat slackened bow. It is characteristic of Bach that he demands it of the wind instruments also, and, to a certain extent, of the clavier and organ as well. The first principle we can deduce from the parts that Bach himself has revised is this, that his phrasing has generally an uptake character. Instead of conceiving in one group the strong beat and the notes of the following weak beats, he groups the latter with the succeeding strong beat. Speaking in general terms, the axiom is that in Bach the accented note is, as a rule, not the commencement, but the end of the group. The grouping that is usual elsewhere is the exception with him. The grouping that is unusual elsewhere is with him the rule. The other possible groupings of the four notes are also more frequent with him than the simple linking of the last three to the first. He prefers figures of this kind. It is unnecessary to quote examples to illustrate this fundamental rule. Anyone who will glance through a few of the cantatas named above will at once meet with a dozen of them, and will then understand why the ordinary phrasing can have no other result by the disfiguring of Bach's music. The second rule is that the intervals which interrupt the natural succession of the notes are to be detached from the tie and played staccato, whether they begin or close the period. The following are typical examples. Ratswahl Cantata, Wir danken dir Gott, number 29, aria. Cantata Ich hab genug, number 82, aria. Secular cantata Preis dein Glück, BG 34, aria. The cases in which the phrasing alters in the same passage owing to a change in the position of the characteristic interval are very instructive. Cantata Susse Trost, mein Jesu kommt, number 151, aria. It is equally important to remember that when a larger interval enters in a sequence that is grouped on a definite principle, it does not submit to the preceding phrasing, but abolishes it. Cantata Herr wie du willst, number 73, aria. Cantata Liebster Gott, wann werd ich sterben, number 8, aria. Cantata Wer sich selbst der heut, der soll erniedrigt werden, number 47, aria. These examples derive their force from the fact that a modern instrumentalist who had them placed before him without any phrasing marks would not play them as above, but on an exactly opposite principle, tying the largest intervals, so that a conductor might say to the cellists who asked him as to the phrasing of a run, "Play it in just the opposite way to what you think is correct, then you will be right." The study of the parts that Bach himself has revised shows us, moreover, the senselessness of the supposed Bach tradition, that when the tempo is not very fast, the notes of the instrumental bass should be detached from each other so as to come out the more clearly. Only certain basses, consisting of natural sequences in uniform quavers or crotchets, are to be played in this way, especially in passages where the music expresses walking or running. In cases of this kind, Bach usually indicates the staccato points for the first bars, or marks the movement staccato sempre. As a rule, however, he demands the same vitality in the grouping of the bass notes as in the other parts. We can even say that the phrasing in the bass is almost more important than elsewhere. If the bass figure is not perceptible to most of the hearers, this is generally due to the fact that it is not phrased in accordance with Bach's intentions, but as a characterless succession of notes. How Bach wishes his basses to be played can be seen from the aria Blut nur in the St. Matthew Passion. At the commencement of the middle section, he phrases the bass thus. In motifs constructed on formulas of this kind, and the final quavers or crotchets are, as a rule, to be separated from each other. In figures founded on the rhythm we must carefully discriminate as to the form to which the phrase belongs. The solemnity rhythm and the passionate rhythm must be phrased in such a way that the short note is heavily accented and drawn, as it were, towards the long note that succeeds it, thus. But if the motive is one expressive of charm or peace, the short note must be quite without accent and drawn towards its predecessor, thus. In triple rhythms, the customary phrasing, in which the unaccented notes are linked in a uniform succession to the preceding accented note, is rather more frequently met with than in the quadruple rhythms. Nevertheless, there are some very significant combinations of other kinds, such as One peculiarity of the figures in the triple rhythms is that Bach more frequently introduces staccato interrupting notes, and more of them, within the ties than he does in the quadruple rhythms. The following are typical cases. Cantata Wer sich selbst erhöht, der soll erniedrigt werden, number 47. Cantata In allen meinen Taten, number 97, aria. Cantata Nimm von uns her, du treuer Gott, number 101, aria. It is noticeable, again, that in the triple rhythms Bach very often introduces variants into the phrasing, as if desirous of breaking a monotony that might spoil his tonal figures. In most cases, the change is made in the bass. In the bass of the aria Jede Woche meinen Wellen, in the cantata Schleicht spielend Wellen, BG 20, he opposes to the normal phrasing the following. In the bass of the aria From Musen, in the secular cantata Tornet ihr Pauken, BG 34, the normal rhythm and the other are placed side by side. The variants in the phrasing in the upper parts are not so sharply antithetical as this, but are all the richer and more interesting. In an aria with accompaniment for a solo violin in the secular cantata Der Zufriedengestellt Eules, BG 11, Bach indicates the following groupings. And in the aria Set was die Liebe tut, in the cantata Der Herr ist mein getruer Hirt, number 85, he groups the last 6 quavers against the first 3. The intention is so delicate that the instrumentalists, as a rule, are not aware of it and simply play 3 uniform and connected triplets. In the runs in the alto aria in the cantata Es wartet alles auf dich, number 181, the antagonism between the natural rhythm of the bar and that of the phrasing is very marked. The following examples will give an idea of the delightful variety of phrasing by means of which Bach tries to overcome the monotony of triple rhythms. Secular cantata Schleicht spielend Wellen, BG 20, aria with solo violin. Christmas oratorio, air with flute accompaniment. Cantata Liebste Jehu, mein Verlangen, number 32, aria. A number of varieties in the phrasing are found in the prelude to an aria in the cantata Lob den Herrn, number 137, of which 3 bars may be quoted here. Footnote: the cantata Schleicht spielend Wellen, BG 20, may be specially recommended for a study of Bach's phrasing in triple times. End footnote. In 12/8 time, again, which is a combination of the triple and the quadruple, Bach varies the phrasing in several ways. Cantata Liebste Gott, wann würd ich sterben, number 8, bass aria. In the rhythms in common time, Bach does not introduce so many varieties of phrasing, though they are plentiful enough for all that, as may be seen in the alto aria Schließe mein Herz in the Christmas oratorio, where we find passages like this in the solo violin part. Generally speaking, however, in 4/4 time he simply differentiates the ties and indicates the natural alternations of staccato and legato. It should be noticed, however, that almost every one of his ties and dots has for its object to ensure the freedom of the phrases as against the ordinary meter of the bar, and to diminish the authority of the strong beats. A typical example of this tendency may be seen in the cross-tying of the notes in an aria in the cantata Ach Gott, wie manches Herzeleid, number 58. Certain other phrasings that alternate regularly between staccato and legato have the same end in view. There is a very significant case of this kind in an aria in the cantata Schweit still plaudert nicht, BG 29. Other movements in which the transition from legato to staccato can be studied are the arias Blüht nur du liebes Herz and Gibst mir meinen Jesum wieder in the St. Matthew Passion. The full wealth of Bach's blending of the two in semi-quaver passages is seen in the orchestral accompaniment to the first chorus of Christ unser Herr zum Jordan kam, number 7. On the whole, we may say that single notes that interrupt the natural flow of the phrases are to be played staccato, especially when they are separated from the other notes by large intervals. If they form a large group of their own, then staccato and legato must alternate within this. In rhythms of this formula, the question as to whether the second note is to be attached to or separated from the first must be settled in each case by the nature of the motive. In the aria Schlummert ein from Ich habe genug, number 82, Bach phrases thus. While he marks the violin solo in the Laudamus Te of the B minor Mass thus. If the first two notes form a large or striking interval, they must, as a rule, be played without legato. It will be generally noticed that Bach's ties and staccato points aim at bringing out as saliently as possible the rhythmic individuality or peculiarity of the phrase, while the ordinary phrasing rather tries to tone down the characteristic quality of the melody, as if it were excessive. No one who has tried to understand the essence of Bach's own phrasing can ever again place unphrased parts before the orchestral players. He will mark the proper ties and dots in the works that have come down to us without them. The task is a long and weary one, but the reward is great. We meet with fewer insoluble problems than we should expect, since a little research into the original parts that have been phrased will always afford us a number of analogies that will elucidate the obscure case. These researches will convince us that Bach's phrasing is throughout deliberate and rational. His ties and dots are always explicable from the nature and the functions of the rhythms and the intervals. The conviction grows upon us that this phrasing is inevitable. Rules can even be found for the variations. His markings in the Christe Eleison of the B minor Mass can astonish only those who regard this one movement alone. As soon as we collect analogous cases, we see that Bach could not, without being untrue to himself, have phrased in any other way than he has done. It is easy, again, to discover why, in the Et in Spiritum Sanctum of the Mass, he writes at one time, and at another, and a little practice will enable us to understand why, in the same movement, he phrases thus, and again thus. The difficulty in some cases will be to decide upon the correct distribution of legato and staccato. Absolute certainty is not always to be expected here. Very instructive examples of the rather rare employment of an uninterrupted staccato may be seen in the cantatas Liebster Jesu mein Verlangen, No. 32, and Wo soll ich fliehen in No. 5. Too much care cannot be taken to ensure the uptake phrasing of the basses. Our instrumentalists are so unaccustomed to it that they do not even observe it when the notes plainly indicate it, as, for example, in the credo of the B minor Mass. The conductor should not only mark the dots and ties in the parts, but should often instruct his players as to the nature of Bach's phrasing. Until the players acquire the instinct of grouping Bach's phrases according to their sense rather than according to the bar divisions, it is hopeless to expect a faithful performance of any of his works. If our instrumentalists are to bring out Bach's phrasing properly, they must understand that it goes along with a great multiplicity of accents that cannot be brought out too sharply. If our orchestras so often think they have fulfilled Bach's intentions when they have done nothing of the kind, it is because they have had regard only to the external aspects of the ties and dots, and have mostly missed the accentuation that can alone convert the separate notes into organic groups. In no composer, as was remarked in connection with the phrasing and accentuation of the clavier works, footnote, on the general principles of Bach accentuation, see Volume 1, end footnote, are the dynamic values of the notes so relative as in Bach. No one makes such play as he with light and shade, but ill luck will have it that the dogma of the dynamic equivalence of the notes in his music is hardly disposed of even yet. The importance of the right accentuation of two tied notes cannot be sufficiently strongly insisted upon. One of them must always be played comparatively heavily, so that the other seems to disappear. If the sequence of notes is in the normal rhythm of the bar, the accent must be given to the first, thus. The more we take from the second note in these cases, the closer we come to Bach's intentions. Passages like those in O Mensch bewein dein Stunde groß in the St. Matthew Passion, and the Domini qui tollis and the qui sedes of the B minor Mass are always played much too cumbrously. If the succession of the two tied notes is contrary to the normal rhythm of the bar, then the second is to be accented even more strongly, if possible, than the first was in the preceding case. In the first chorus of the B minor Mass, this cross accentuation must place the normal 4/4 accent quite in the shade. A very instructive light on the question of the treatment of three tied notes is afforded by the introductory numbers of the cantata Es ist nichts Gesundes an meinem Leibe, number 25, and Jesus schlaft, was soll ich hoffen, number 81. The orchestral accompaniment has quite a different effect when accented thus. With a certain obtrusiveness of emphasis instead of the notes being made practically uniform. Bach's purpose here is the same as in the orchestral accompaniment to the first Kyrie in the B minor Mass. He wants to throw a strong counter accent onto the second and fourth beats, and by means of the antagonism between this and the natural bar accent, to ensure the animated variety of rhythm that is necessary for the elasticity of his figures. This method of treating 4/4 time is very common with him. It is one of the distinguishing characteristics of his style. A comparison of Handelian and Mozartian pieces in common time with those of Bach will show that in the two former there is hardly a trace of these continual rhythmic constraints. In Beethoven they are more frequent, but not so frequent as in Bach, who indeed always intends them where he indicates or presupposes phrasings of this kind. Or the general rule may be laid down that Bach's tie mostly means that a strong accent must fall on one of the inner notes comprised within the tie. This gives uncommon force to the correct accentuation of the uptake phrasing, a bass in a regular motion, of the outline of which the hearer is never conscious when it is accented in the ordinary way, becomes unexpectedly plastic when it is phrased and accented thus. The most instructive example in this respect is the Credo of the B minor Mass, the majestic bass figure of which is generally lost upon the hearer owing to its uptake character not being properly brought out by means of the accentuation. If, however, it is phrased in this way, it will come out clearly, without there being any necessity to strengthen the instruments. The basses in the chorus Sind Blitz, sind Donner in the St. Matthew Passion should be played in this manner. If they are to stand out prominently. The result will show that this is how Bach conceived them. There are thus innumerable cases in which Bach's fine bass figures can be made to tell by letting the hearer perceive them, as it were, through the breaks in the normal accentuation of the bar. Retardations, syncopations, and all other notes that have any rhythmical peculiarity should be brought out strongly, especially in the triple times. In this regard, however, our worthy instrumentalists are curiously coy. It costs endless trouble to get them to play such passages properly, even in the most striking rhythms. In the characteristic passage in the theme of the aria Qui sedes in the B minor Mass, it is difficult to persuade them that the natural accent of the first quaver is to be regarded only as a preliminary accent to that of the third. Motives constructed on this formula are to be accented contrary to the normal rhythm of the bar. The strong accent which we necessarily associate with the first note must be regarded as a kind of springboard to the main accent on the second note. At the commencement of the aria Ach, nun ist mein Jesu hin in the St. Matthew Passion, we should accordingly play thus. Notes of small value, especially when they precede an accent, are generally made most effective when played with a certain heaviness, as if we were afraid they might pass by unobserved. This remark holds good in particular for certain motives that are founded on the rhythm of solemnity or passion. It should be recognized that the Bach staccato means, in the majority of cases, not a lightening but a certain weighting of the note. These rules as to the accent in Bach, founded as they are on his own phrasing marks, are confirmed by what we know of the nature of his themes and motives. It has been already remarked in connection with the clavier works that their structure is not always clear from the natural rhythm of the bar, their real form very often only becoming apparent in the main accent that comes at the end. This is true of the themes of the cantatas to an even larger extent. They are much freer and bolder in their construction than the clavier themes, Bach having kept in view in the latter the limited possibilities of phrasing and accentuation on a keyed instrument. All the earlier notes strive, as it were, towards the principal accent. Before its entry we have the impression of chaos. When it comes, it relieves the tension and makes everything clear in a moment. The restlessness is at an end. The theme stands before us in plastic outlines. We perceive the musical period as an organic whole. If we do not experience this sense of tension followed by relief, the theme has not been properly played. It has been phrased in the ordinary rhythm of the bars, instead of in its fundamental rhythm. It is important to observe that in the mighty periods in which Bach conceives his themes, the principal accent is led up to and from by one or more preliminary or supplementary accents, the former process, however, being as a rule longer than the latter. We must therefore emphasize the characteristic intervals and the notes that form the culminating point or the conclusion of a melodic line, whether they fall on a strong or a weak part of the bar. In general, this rule will coincide with the one previously formulated as to the accenting of retardations, syncopations, and other salient notes in the rhythm. The difference made to a Bach theme by not accenting the strong and semi-strong beats of the bar can be studied to advantage in the final chorus of the first part of the St. Matthew Passion. If the instrumentalists are allowed to play the ascending semiquaver passage in the way that seems most natural to them, they will accent the E at the commencement of the third beat, in which case the hearer will not get the sense of the interval of the seventh that is the basis of the passage. If, however, the accent is thrown on the A of the beginning of the fourth beat, the line makes its proper effect on him. In the former case he will hear in the latter case nor should we play thus in this chorus. But thus. If we accent in this way the final points of the lines and the characteristic intervals, we get a certain rhythmical tension between the upper parts, violin, violas, oboes, and flutes, and the basses, which keep to the normal bar accentuation. Only in this way can the hearer be made conscious of the wailing motives of the upper parts. Previously they were lost in the bar rhythm. He no longer gets the impression of monotony which he could not ward off when the movement was rendered in the ordinary way. Special attention should be given to the melodic lines that Bach traces with the joy motive. Take as a typical example the splendid motive from the instrumental accompaniment to the first chorus of Was mein Gott will, das geschieht allzeit, number 111. The usual accentuation on the first and third beats does not bring out the meaning of the passage. If, however, we accent the second and fourth beats in such a way that the main emphasis falls on the last beat of the second bar, the hearer gets a sense of the heaven-storming, joyous faith that Bach desires to express in the motive. The effects that can be made by the appropriate accentuation of even small melodic lines may be seen in the first chorus of Wachet auf, number 140, by accenting according to its real nature the semiquaver motive that depicts the hurried wakening, instead of according to the normal 3/4 scheme. In this chorus, again, we can study how to bring out clearly those themes of Bach that are based on scale figures. Much can also be learned in this respect from the first chorus of Ach, wie flüchtig. The characteristic accentuation of complete themes may be illustrated by two examples from the St. Matthew Passion. The commencement of the aria, Gern will ich mich bekämen, should be played thus. This accentuation prepares the way for the principal accent in the remainder of the theme. When we accent the theme in this way, bringing out heavily the descending notes after the preliminary accent and between the main accent and the succeeding accent, the theme strikes the bearer as a connected whole, and at the same time he understands how it expresses the obeisance implied in the words Gern will ich mich bekämen. With the ordinary accentuation, both the form and the sense of the theme are completely lost. For the first period of the theme of the aria Gest mit meinem Jesum wieder, we should disregard the 4/4 meter and accent thus. The second period should be played on analogous lines. Bach's desire to have the second and fourth beats accented throughout is clearly shown by his ties and by the way in which he makes the other instruments accompany the solo violin. Footnote: the phrasing and accentuation of a number of themes have been already discussed in connection with the works in which they occur. End footnote. We need have no fear that by bringing out strongly the greater and smaller outlines, and by accenting the characteristic notes in what it often seems at first an almost unnatural way, we shall give the melody a restless and unrhythmical character. We shall always observe that when the theme is rightly accented, the bar rhythm is still felt to be implicit. When we ask for this kind of phrasing and accentuation from an orchestra with merely a superficial knowledge of Bach, the instrumentalists feel like a man who is asked to declaim instead of speaking in the ordinary way. But just as the latter comes to see in time that what seemed affected to him at first is the correct thing, and what seemed natural is merely a negligent way of speaking, so it happens with the players. What they thought unnatural at first becomes more and more self-evident to them. At the same time, they begin to realize how much Bach's music asks of them. They see that each of them must feel himself to be a soloist, and that a correct performance is impossible unless each of them realizes from moment to moment the true connection of the notes, internal as well as external. An orchestra that is merely a herd of driven beasts is of no use for playing Bach. We often hear very good orchestras play the accompaniments to the cantatas and passions in mediocre style, simply because the players have no idea of the demands that this music, which is not difficult in itself, especially as regards the strings, makes upon the musical imagination of each individual. On the other hand, we shall find that ordinary orchestras sometimes play Bach excellently when they really try to do so. A conductor with the gift of inspiring enthusiasm will not shrink even from performing the cantatas occasionally with military bands. End of chapter 35, part 1. The performance of the cantatas and passions.